I have ripped this end of my fabric, so I know this is the straight of grain. Avoid the temptation to line up your selvages. Your selvages are rarely straight, but if you rip one side of your fabric, you know that this side is straight. So I'm going to use my ripped side as my line-up end. Lay my fabric flat on the cutting board. You'll see that this other end over here is not straight either, but it doesn't matter because we're not going to cut that anyway. Don't worry about what your selvage is doing. Only worry that your ripped end is lined up. Make sure your folded end is smooth. Fold it in half up toward your selvage. Don't try to line it up with your selvage because again, your selvage isn't straight. Line up the side that's been ripped. Line up this edge over here. We're still going to cut this straight because when you rip fabric, sometimes you have little dashes in it or it's not quite as perfect as we would like for a binding. But this is how you get your fabric prepped, right? So we're going to lay this out like this. We're going to take our ruler and we're going to cut our first cut just to clean up the edge. So I'm going to line up a solid line on the fold, a solid line on my ruler, right on the fold. Then I'm just going to clean this edge up because you always want to have a nice clean edge to cut with. If you don't happen to be ambidextrous, flip your fabric back around, make sure everything's lined up really straight, okay? Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to line up our ruler with the fold on our fabric. Our straight line is lined up with the fold. Our 2.5 inch line is lined up on the cut side. If you like to cut your binding 2 1/4 or even 2, that's fine. Some people like their bindings to be bigger. Standard width is usually 2.5. I usually cut most of my bindings at 2 1/4. If I'm going to hand stitch them on the back, I like them 2 1/4. If I'm going to machine stitch it, I like it closer to 2.5 or 2 3/4. So we're going to, every time we move our ruler over, we're going to line up the solid line with the fold and the dotted line with the cut. And we're going to cut 9 strips. So I have all 9 of my strips. They're all stacked up, right sides up. We're going to flip them over because we're going to mark the back sides of our fabric because that's what we're actually going to sew on. So I'm going to take my first piece and I'm going to flip it right way up. If you're using a solid or a batik or a woven or something that doesn't have a really obvious right or wrong side, do yourself a favor and mark it some way or the other to make sure that you're putting the right sides together. This fabric has an obvious right and wrong side, but I'm going to put my fabrics together like this. One of those things that I still do backwards sometimes is I will forget, do I sew my angle this way or do I sew my angle this way? You want to make sort of a backwards L with your fabric. But if you sew an angle this way, it's very different than if you sew it this way. So what I'll do is I still do this. I put my hand on my fabric and then I fold it. And if it doesn't make a longer strip, then that's not the move, right? So I'll put my hand the other way on the angle. And when I fold this over, oh look, it does make a longer strip and that's what we want. We're gonna mark this first line from angle to angle. I'm gonna line up my 45-degree line on my ruler here. And like I said, I don't cut my selvages off because we're going to cut those away after we make this. So you want to make sure that your selvages are not in the line that you're about to mark. This is why we always round our strips up so that we have more room to cut away. So my 45-degree line is lined up with this side of my strip. With a friction pen, I'm just going to mark a line. Okay. Now this is going to be your cheat one for right now. Okay, so we're going to take our whole stack. This is our first strip. We don't have to mark that. Here's our cheat strip. So take a strip, lay it on your table. My 45-degree line needs to match up so that my angle is drawn that way. So I'm going to line here's my 45 on my ruler. I'm going to line that up with my strip, along the strip. And that, lining this line up with the long side of your strip, make sure that this is at the right angle. If you just kind of eyeball it and put this down and go, okay, that's probably right, it's probably not, actually. So use your ruler in the way that it's designed for you. This is one of the reasons that those lines are marked on there. And then just mark every one of these. Okay, so I just mark them and then I stack them up. All right, so now we have all of our strips marked. I will take this to my sewing machine and lay this on my lap, and I'll sew one end at a time. If that seems a little too much to keep track of for you, you can pin each end each time if you want to. You can pin or not. I find that pinning is much easier in this step, and I will usually put my pins right underneath my drawn line, because then I can sew over that strip. Now, if you want to pin all of them, you can. You can just do them all at one time. So I'm going to take the other end. This is the end that we just pinned. We're going to put the next one on. And again, if you're not sure about the folding, go ahead and test yourself. And I'll pin all of them together before I go to the machine. So when we get to our machine, I've got an open-toed foot because I want to be able to see that crack right there in between the feet so that I can line it up with that line. First thing I'll do is I'll drop my needle, because then I can take the L shape right here, this 90-degree angle, and I can put it right where my needle's down, and I know that I'm starting in the right spot. Then I'll drop my foot. You don't have to backstitch this, but you can if you choose to. And we're just going to sew straight down that line. If you're going nice and slow, you don't have to worry that much about sewing over pins. This is also the reason that I use long, thin pins, so that I can just sew right over them. I'm going to do that, and I just stack my seams and sew all of them at one time. So like chain piecing your binding. And we're just going to sew all 8 of these seams. All right, so now I know it looks like a mess, but it's a functional mess. So I'm gonna pull all my pins out and snip the thread in between from the chain piecing. You can either snip the threads and go back and do the next step, or I like to press all my seams open before I trim away the seams. I just feel like you get a flatter press if you do that. So we're just gonna cut these all apart, and we should have a nice long piece of continuous binding. It is important to press your seams open for binding because you are going to be putting this onto the quilt, and if you pressed your seams closed and then you started to put them together and then you folded them again, you end up with this really thick wad of fabric right there. But since we sewed it on the diagonal and we're going to press our seam open, what happens now is when we put all of this together, you won't have that huge lump. So I press my seams open and then I just use scissors. If scissors makes you nervous, you can use a ruler and rotary cutter to make about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. A little bigger is not that big a deal. Don't make it too much smaller though, because you do want this seam to really hold nicely. Since we've sewn this on a 45-degree angle and we've pressed these open, when we fold our sides together and then we fold it again, there is hardly any extra thickness right there. Okay. I will always press my seams first before I cut my fabric away. It disperses the weight of the fabric better if you do it this way and then trim it away, because you're not trying to open just a tiny little seam. And I will press it first and then cut it, and then I will press it again, because I want this to be very, very flat. I'm going to take all of this stuff to my ironing board because I want to show you a few tricks on laying your fabric out. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of ways to close up your binding when you're done at the very end. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways to prep the beginning of your binding. If you're going to take your binding and stuff it down inside and top stitch it, then you need to make your angle at the beginning of your binding in a way that you can do that. So we're going to, like we did at the beginning when we were making our binding, we're going to make a 45-degree angle. Okay. And I'm going to press this. And it depends on which direction you're going to sew this on your quilt. If it's going to go on the front of your quilt, then the raw edges need to be over here to the right. If it's going to go on the back, they need to be on the other side. So the way I always remember that is when I have my binding laying here, I bring the top down toward me and I press a fold. Okay. Then I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut this away so that there is approximately a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You want to get rid of as much bulk as possible. We're going to fold these wrong sides together, but we want to make sure that everything lines very clean. Another thing that I really think is important is to make sure that the edge that you press is very crisp. especially if you're going to hand stitch your binding, you want to have this fold to be super sharp. Otherwise it looks a little bulky and floppy, and it's harder to stitch through it and make it look really clean. So I will fold my fabric up away from me and make sure that this edge is really straight. Now, if your iron doesn't get really hot, or you want to have a good crisp edge, I really like to put flatter on my binding. You can either spray it before you start, or you can press it, you can fold it over and press it once, and then just do a light spray and press it again. Now, I know this seems like a lot of steps, but it really does come out so much better in the end. You can also steam at this point. Anything it takes to get a really nice, tight, crisp fold right there is really important. So you don't have to do this if you're going to join your ends on your binding when you're all done, but this is kind of a beginner's way. So if you make this angle, what's going to happen is you're going to put this on your quilt. All your raw edges are going to be over here. When you get down to the end, you're going to stuff the end of your binding in there like an envelope. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and press the rest of this binding off. All right, our binding's all ready to go. Next step is to attach it to the quilt.